Of a series of discussions we've been having on sanctuary. After we analyzed the history of the concept, members of the discussion wanted to pursue the way in which sanctuary might be practiced. That happened exactly to suit the agenda of the seminar on sanctuary, which has been convened since the beginning of the semester, in which students have both studied analytically what the concept is, and they have placed themselves within groups who are concerned with sanctuary. And they, during the course of the semester, will be assessing what concepts of sanctuary are being deployed, how effectively they're being applied, and on the basis of that, how they would recommend proceeding along that line of social action. We had the first such extra session last week. Now this week we are turning to two distinct campus movements for sanctuary. This has been the particular interest of Lila Klaus, who is in the course, and she will be moderating the discussion today and posing questions. At the close of the panel discussion, you're invited to ask questions, make observations. Just to point out to you that I've asked Lila to repeat your question for you. That's not intended as criticism. It is simply so that the question will get on the videotape recording as well as the answer. So I hope you all enjoy today's session.
Thank you again so much for coming. So today with us we have Olivia Tersian and Acacia Handel, who will be representing organizing for undocumented students' rights. And then we also have with us Alicia Rodriguez, who will be representing Hoodies BARD, and as well as the other various organizations and initiatives that they're involved with on campus. So to start, can you guys give a little bit of a brief overview about OUSR, as we call it for short, and kind of the history and trajectory of that, and maybe give some background about Hoodies and their objectives?
Sure. So when I first got to BARD, I quickly got involved in student activism and helped to found an organization called The Draft, which is both a human rights-oriented publication and a coalition of student activists, aspiring journalists, and artists who meet weekly to discuss current political events and social justice issues both on campus and off. And so The Draft in 2015 became affiliated with an organization called Freedom University, which is based out of Atlanta. And so essentially in 2011, the Atlanta Board of Regents had instituted two policies that barred undocumented students from both receiving in-state tuition and accessing Atlanta's top 5 public universities. And so as a result of that, Freedom University was founded to provide higher education to undocumented students and help them to access higher education institutions outside of the state of Georgia. And so we became affiliated with them. We hosted a panel discussion with them in 2015 and helped a lot of the students there apply to BARD. And 7 BARD students went down to Atlanta in 2016 to participate in a 3-day workshop and civil disobedience action in which we held integrated classrooms in 3 of the universities that banned undocumented students. I think 14 total students were arrested, and this was a demonstration of protest to these policies that had been instituted by the Board of Regents. And so as a result of that affiliation with Freedom University, a bunch of students from The Draft became affiliated with BARD Immigration Group, which was a group that had been started by a few undocumented students at BARD a few years ago who were struggling being undocumented at BARD and wanted to cultivate a sense of community and access resources that would help facilitate their transition in this space. And so when those students graduated, they asked a few of us who had been at the Freedom University protest to take over BIG, and we eventually transformed that into OUSR, Organizing for Undocumented Students' Rights, which, the work that we were doing took on obviously a different significance and urgency after the election. So we'll talk about that later.
Million Hoodies Bard started last fall, and we started this organization just as like, because it's for the movement, you know, towards the justice of Black lives. And so it's an organization that has nationwide chapters. So we have chapters in like University of Northern California, but we also like have chapters in citywide. So it depends. We have campus-based chapters and city-based chapters. And depending on whether you're working nationally or on the local level, we work on ways in which we could work with the local community to provide like safety and justice for what we feel like are the issues of the like people of color at Bard. So we work with communities in Kingston and Red Hook and like other surrounding areas to see what we can do. Like depending on what we decide like in meetings are what we want to work on, we work on things like last semester we did a civil disobedience at TD Bank and we had a protest. So we have all kinds of things. Sometimes we just do like mindfulness workshops, like making sure our members are taking care of themselves, like meditation workshops.
Cool. So you guys, since you all cover sort of a wide range of topics, but all kind of generally falling under the sanctuary movement and immigration justice in this country, what are your thoughts about what about the successes and the limitations on kind of the sanctuary movement as a whole, kind of both within the country as a whole and kind of also at Bard as well?
I think the most obvious limitation is that there are no actual legal implications of sanctuary. But I think, at least at Bard, it's created, and nationwide, it's created an important dialogue that needs to be happening right now. And for me, it's the dialogue and the awareness that's been happening. That's been the greatest success, and the movement and the momentum of the movement and the continuation of the movement.
Yeah, so as Olivia said, the sanctuary movement, both as it pertains to sanctuary cities and sanctuary campuses, the term itself is fairly vague and doesn't have a strict legal definition, which I think can pose certain problems because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, especially I've noticed amongst the student body at Bard in terms of what it actually means to be a sanctuary campus. And also I just feel obligated to point out that Bard never declared itself a sanctuary campus. And I know that a lot of students continue to say that it has, and it has not. So I think it's important to not overemphasize the protections that the school can provide, because that in and of itself could put students' livelihoods in jeopardy. So that's certainly one limitation, is the vagueness of the term, and then also that it could potentially put universities and cities, make them targets for any sort of federal crackdown. So obviously a lot of legislators have said that they're going to withdraw federal funding from colleges and universities that have declared themselves sanctuary campuses and for cities that have declared themselves sanctuary cities. So that is definitely a risk that campuses and cities take when they declare themselves to be a sanctuary. But there are innumerable benefits. I think it started a really important dialogue at Bard. I think a lot of Bard students really don't understand what it means to be undocumented. And so I think through having the petition that was circulated that generated 1,300 signatures, students really began a process of learning about the lives and the struggles faced by their fellow students. And it was a great demonstration of solidarity. So.
I agree on the last part when she was talking about, you know, like the importance of just spreading information, and just the beginning of the conversation with Sanctuary Campus, like, just brings forth information a lot of people don't know, and like, you can never blame someone for not knowing something they never really had to think about. And so just forcing each other to think about what's happening all around our community, and to people that we don't even know are going through things. We always talk about, you never know what someone's going through at home. It goes the same for undocumented students. Like, I never talked about it until I was documented because it's really scary. So I think just the conversation started something really important. But like, like it just by no means that like means that we're ready for anything bigger, because we aren't a sanctuary campus, and that runs its own risks. So I think like making sure that everybody's really well informed on what it means to possibly be a sanctuary campus, but also what it means that we're not a sanctuary campus declared officially.
Yeah, and going off of that topic of discussion where BARD hasn't officially declared itself a sanctuary campus, because of this, what do you think are the necessary steps that BARD should take in order to ensure that students are as safe as possible? And what would you picture a sanctuary campus at BARD to look like?
Something that I think a lot of people don't understand, or that like, I just think, well, on the topic of possibly declaring ourselves a sanctuary campus means that we could lose federal funding. I think that applies to more than just like the livelihoods of undocumented students. I think it also applies to, at BARD, for example, the community of color, because a lot of students are under scholarships that are federally funded, and that would like greatly harm the colored community at BARD. I mean, if we lost funding, like personally, I wouldn't be able to afford to go here. And like I know a lot of students who wouldn't either. And other students who are not even people of color also receive federal funding. And so I think it just becomes dangerous because of like the messy lines of like, who do we side with? And we don't want to pick a side, but like, it's just really messy. And I think like it has a lot more levels than just there's a right side and a wrong side. And that's why it's such a long discussion, but that's why it's a discussion that needs to be had. But in terms of what sanctuary would look like at BARD, I think that that's like something that I wouldn't necessarily really be able to ask for, because it's really not my place. And so I think like something that we need to do is discuss, more importantly, how that's not our place to really decide, because there are certain protections that I don't need. And so we have to be thinking not about like what we think people need, but what we know for a fact that people need. And I think it becomes more of a conversation, including actual undocumented students in the conversation.
Yeah, I think that last point is exceedingly important. And so, yeah, going back to this misunderstanding that people have of sanctuary campuses, I think people believe that if you declare yourself a sanctuary campus, that means that you have instituted a set of protections, and if you haven't declared yourself a sanctuary campus, you don't have those protections, and that's not actually how it plays out in the real world. So BARD, after the sanctuary petition was circulated, the school created a working group that included administration, faculty, students, and staff to discuss what sanctuary would actually look like at BARD, and if it would actually be feasible and smart for the school to make a public declaration of sanctuary. So ultimately, the group decided not to make a public declaration of sanctuary, but they drafted a document full of recommendations and suggestions for policies and practices that the school should institute in order to be more of a sanctuary to undocumented and refugee students. And so I think there are a lot of practical steps that institutions can take to actually be a sanctuary without making that public declaration that would potentially put them in jeopardy in terms of any federal funding that they or their students receive. So some steps that BARD already did take. BARD used to have undocumented students have to apply as international students, which was incredibly difficult for students because the whole international student application just really doesn't apply to people who have been living in the United States for years and years. And so I had worked with a lot of undocumented students from Freedom University who were applying to BARD, and they actually found themselves basically unable to complete their applications because large sections of the application didn't apply to them. So that was definitely making BARD fairly inaccessible to undocumented students. So right after the election, after OUSR had been conversing with the people at admissions finally decided to change their policy so that undocumented students could apply as domestic applicants. So that was a huge change for BARD. So that was one step that it took. And then obviously the BARD Sanctuary Fund was created after the petition was circulated, and the working group developed this set of recommendations. And so I think one of the biggest problems that we have found is the problem of accessibility. If it's difficult for a large number of undocumented students to even be accepted and actually be able to financially access BARD, then there's not even really that much of a conversation about what we can do to protect students when they're on this campus. Because if they can't get to this campus, you know, that conversation doesn't need to be had. So a lot of what we've been working on through OUSR has been the problem of access. So, and there are plenty of projects and ideas we have moving forward for how BARD could be an even better sanctuary. So.
Yeah, I mean, my point is that Keisha's exactly. So, I mean, my focus with Sanctuary Campus at BARD moving forward and what it would look like would be to focus. The only thing that we can ensure is that the administration would fully support undocumented students, at least financially. That's the only, like, as people who like do not deal with these issues, that's the only thing that, I mean, we can know for sure and comment on, I guess. Yeah.
And maybe just to clarify that point, so what we found out through working with Freedom University students, eventually one of the students who we had helped apply to BARD, who was undocumented, was accepted to BARD and received a full tuition scholarship, but that still left close to like $20,000 a year in room and board fees, which if you're undocumented, you can't apply for federal or state financial aid, and like work study is difficult. So $20,000 a year is sort of an impossible feat for a lot of undocumented students to cover. So that was partially why the BARD Sanctuary Fund was created, to cover those fees. So that's something that we learned about financial accessibility. I had another point that I really wanted to make, and now it's totally slipping my mind, so I'll make it later.
I want to kind of roll back to a point that you had made earlier about the election, and I'm curious about kind of your own histories that you mentioned about as activists and student leaders with the current political administration that we have. I'm curious about how the election and kind of everything that's resulted, how has that impacted your organization and your relationship to activism?
I did not. I would personally say that I did not really become politicized until about 3 years ago, maybe. My family and I moved here when I was like 5 or 6 years old, and so we were undocumented until about the summer of 2013. We got our permanent residency. So I didn't really I would just say that I didn't really care about politics, because I was raised to think that like we're not really Americans, we just live here, so like none of these things apply to us, and like things like legislation and laws and people who are in power just didn't apply to us, because like it was something that we weren't really allowed to have an opinion on, because it's not like we could vote on anything, but also because I think we just had like other worries, like just getting used to living here. And so I think on that topic, what we don't think about when thinking about like undocumented lives in general is like how much more goes into it than thinking about getting legal status, because for many years we were not thinking about getting legal status. It was like thinking about getting a job and paying the bills and sending us to school. And I think like until we got our legal status, I was able to like allow myself to like sort of start ignoring what my mom said and start making myself care. And so when I got here, like last year, my first year, and like through everything that was happening with the election, and like in recent years the like super blowing up of police brutality and stuff like that on social media is really what like started make me start caring a lot more about like social activism and civil disobedience and things like that. So especially after the election, I just had like a crazy sense of urgency to like know everything that I could possibly know. I just wanted to be bombarded with information just to make sure that like I could have conversations like this and like get into arguments that needed to be had. And just like the election just made me really angry, but like just in a really productive way, because like it just felt like powerless, but also like a conversation was brought forward that like was always just needed to be had.
So yeah, I think we all saw the election create a huge sense of urgency for organizing around many issues, and then what ended up happening for me was that the urgency was directed towards immigration rights, and that comes from my own family's personal history. So my father immigrated to the States from Lebanon during the Civil War, and he had come here on a tourist visa because he didn't have time to apply for like a refugee visa. It would take too much time, and he wasn't sure he could even get it. So he applied for a tourist visa, and he managed to get here. And his whole story and his whole process of being an immigrant, and he never really conceptualized himself as an immigrant when he came here, because he he had always like thought of himself as like as an artist, and so he never really wanted to put like that image of himself. He othered himself from being an immigrant, and that's a whole nother story. But but anyway, after the election, it changed something in him, and the way that immigration rights were being discussed in the media, and the way that the media was reacting to it, and the way that the communities were reacting to it. I think he started to identify as an immigrant again, or maybe for the first time. And for me, that's what really pushed me to foreground organizing, because this was the first time that like I saw my father actually kind of come to terms with like who he was, and like to see that like an election, like something like this that could like really reconceptualize someone's identity of themselves. And like my whole life, my dad's like put my needs and like my brother's needs before his own, and like finally like now I can like do that for him, and like this is, you know, my way of connecting with like his identity. And so that's where the election really kicked in my personal, where everything kind of crossed for me.
Yeah, I think as everyone has stated, the election just created this new sense of urgency that motivated my organizing. And so OUSR had already existed prior to the election, and we had been doing a lot of organizing around undocumented students' rights, as the name suggests. But the election, I think, was just a massive paradigm shift for all of us. Even though I was incredibly anxious about Trump being elected, it hadn't clicked that could really be a possibility. So I think it was just a really devastating experience, I think, for the majority of us, especially people who had sort of come to political consciousness during the Obama administration, which, you know, as is important to emphasize, Obama deported more people than any other president in history. So it's important to understand that, you know, this work was important before, and we're not just fighting Trump, but we're fighting, you know, longstanding xenophobic ideologies and practices that will not be rooted out just with the election of a new president. So this is going to be a sustained struggle, and already has been. But for those of us who did come to political consciousness under the Obama administration, I think there was a sense that this country was moving in a certain direction, albeit very slowly, but there was a sense of progress, and a lot of us especially developed our own political ideologies through the appearance of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it just seemed like, you know, we were making these small wins in terms of public consciousness and policy. And so to see our country devolve so quickly was really quite astonishing. And so I think that devastation just made us understand that there was a much greater need for community than had ever existed before. So it wasn't just, you know, organizing to institute these protections for our most vulnerable people, both on campus and off, but it was making sure that people who were feeling that devastation quite personally because of the intersection of their identities felt supported and understood that no matter what happened, there were people around them who would have their back and fight for them and fight for their rights and be there. So I think that was really what the election taught a lot of us.
Yeah, and kind of building off of some points that you just made there, also talking about your own personal relationships with activism and organization, you all occupy various roles, whether that be an immigrant or an ally, or kind of both, or almost in a way. So also, how does the differentiation between an ally versus an immigrant affect your relationship with political activism?
I think, well, I am an immigrant, and I think there are conversations that I definitely have to make myself a part of, because I just feel like there needs to be some kind of representation, but also just a clear distinction of like how different every single immigrant is, and like it just depends like simply on the country where you immigrated from, how old you were, the circumstances of why you immigrated. Like every single story is so different, just has like certain core like similarities, but like some people come here and they can get legal status pretty soon. Some people live here for 20 years and don't have legal status. Some people, you know, never have to think about those things. And I think having a clear distinction of like showing up somewhere and being like, this is what I am. This is my relationship to this conversation. Like, I'm an ally, I'm an immigrant. I show one immigrant perspective among millions. And I think in this conversation, for me, it's important to be here just because it was something that I struggled with for so long. And like, I always knew I was an immigrant, but I never really identified with the word undocumented because I never really thought about it because I was so young. And my parents just never really talked about it until like I became like I got older and learning about it, and I was like, okay, this is what I am. And so I think the distinction between ally and immigrant is knowing when is your place to speak, when is your place to show up as something. So like when 1 Million Hoodies hosted the TD Bank protest, I like helped organize it, I helped make banners and stuff, but my mom asked me not to go, and I understood because like she's just scared that I'm gonna get deported. And it's like, it's a real fear, like I'm not a citizen. So it is like something that my parents think about, and so they see me like on social media active on like against the administration, against whatever, and it brings like a fear within my family because of something we fought for 13 years. So it's like, you know, how easily can you give it up? So I think it's like, that's why it's important to have like allies at like protests, because you can show up at the front lines and they are less likely to do something to you. And so I think just like showing up in certain places, but knowing when is your time to show up. So allowing communities of color their spaces to work on their issues amongst each other, because there's just a perspective that you can't really have if you're not identifying with that community. So I think just like allowing the distinction of allowing us our spaces to organize our issues amongst each other, but showing up when we could benefit a lot from just ally presence.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a little weird because I'm both influenced and informed by my dad's experience as an immigrant, and like, I'm clearly white and I have the privileges of being white, but if you look at my brother, he looks very Middle Eastern, and he's been called a terrorist before. So I have the benefits and the privileges of being like a very white female citizen, but my brother, who is also a white citizen, has faced a lot of the discrimination that my dad has faced. So for me, I feel that I should and I need to use my privileges of being who I am, and like, because my brother can't use the privileges in the same way that I can, even though like we come from the same parents. And I think it's just really important for those who do have the privileges to use those privileges for those who don't.
Yeah, I think like most of what needs to be said has been said. Obviously, for those of us who are allies in this conversation, it's important to follow the leadership and the direction of immigrants, of undocumented people of color, and not just people who are organizing right now, but there's such a long history of immigrant rights organization that's been so beautiful and sustained and powerful and effective. And so I think it's important to really learn from that rich history. And yeah, this is something that I think about a lot at Bard, because the organizing community at Bard is shockingly small. Like, unfortunately, I think our campus is pretty apathetic when it comes to politics and social justice. So, you know, whereas in the world there are a lot of organizations to plug into, and if you're an ally, it's easier to just be there as an ally. I think it's trickier when there's such a small community of people organizing. You know, just to be frank, I'm a white citizen who's one of the heads of organizing for undocumented students' rights, and that fact makes me very uncomfortable on a daily basis, and I'm hoping that I won't have to be the head for much longer. I'm hoping that other people take up the leadership, and it is a club that was started by undocumented people who unfortunately couldn't find other people to take on the leadership when they left school. So yeah, but there are so many organizations both at Bard doing similar types of organization that we can work in conjunction with, and there are organizations on a national scale, like our sanctuary petition that we circulated was done at the request of one of the largest immigrants' rights organizations in the country, Cosecha. We were on a conference call with them immediately after the election. They had a list of 7 demands that they wanted students to circulate to their institutions. And so most of the things that we've done have been at the request of immigrants' rights organizations and modeled after strategies that they have created. So yeah, and I think also thinking about, civil disobedience is obviously a huge part of activism. And so I think the question of risk is something that's really important, especially in this conversation with people who have very vulnerable legal statuses, both knowing when you need to use your privilege to step up, because let's say if you're at an action where there are potentially going to be arrests, if you're a citizen, that's something that's much easier for you to, it's a risk that's easier for you to accept. But I think I also have come into contact with a lot of activists who are really only interested in participating in very showy, public, high-risk actions that energize them. And I think that's something that activists really need to keep in mind, is that you need to ensure that you are not bringing additional risks to vulnerable people who you're claiming to act on behalf of. And I've noticed that a lot of actions that are being publicized that have to do with DACA or different immigrant rights struggles, now at the end of every description of the event, they have a paragraph saying, please, this is going to be a nonviolent action. We don't want to escalate tensions with the police. Please be sure you just follow our leadership. And they feel the need to really, really emphasize that, because I think there are so many instances of just white male anarchists wanting to smash things and actually totally putting people in jeopardy who they're claiming to stand in solidarity with. So I think it's important to, yes, definitely know your place, know when to step up and accept the risk, and know when you should not be bringing additional risks to the people around you. So.
Actually, in the same vein of social activism, with Cosecha, actually, a few of us from the Million Hoodies chapter I'm not sure what semester, last year at some point, went to a conference in Boston, and so we did different levels of training, so talking about how do we talk about this, what is Cosecha's deal, what are their goals, what are their demands, things like that. But also we did some small actions, we made and hung banners all over Boston on different bridges. We did artistic interruptions of train stations with music, and we did a small little action in an Old Navy or a Gap or something, and there was a lot of us, and we would just play music and start dancing to attract attention. And at the end, one person shared a statement about undocumented rights. And I think just working with Cosecha as Million Hoodies members opened us to how many different types of activism there is. So Cosecha, the Movimiento Cosecha has a lot of adult undocumented people, and that's a different kind of person than us college students, because I'm a little wilder. I will show up at an action when I probably shouldn't be, but there's a different fear when you're a parent, when you have children, when you have a job, when I go to college and I have a scholarship, but I could be a busboy, and so I think thinking about how there's different type of activisms, and to respect the kind of work that's happening in different spaces, because there are different people trying to go for the same overall ending, but there's different ways and other people feel comfortable stepping out of their comfort zones. At the Cosecha movement, there were people who were I'm scared to go places, as an adult, and it's I lived in this country for 40 years, and just now am I deciding to do something about it? And it's just accepting that it's not the same process for everyone.
Yeah, along that lines of student activism, specifically as activists again and leaders as yourselves, why do you feel that is important for students to be involved in educational and institutional reforms to help undocumented students and immigrants?
I think that this question, when you sent it to us, I was thinking about it, but I just realized that it's a lot simpler than just we all have basic knowledge of something. When we all take sit-sci, we think about like how our president says we all need a basic understanding of scientific knowledge to have some kind of success in the world, like to understand what we understand this information, distinguishing what is fact and what is opinion and things like that. So we all understand how to use a pipette, but do we all understand like the lives of the people around us, like the communities around us? You never know what the person sitting next to you in class is going through, right? You never know if that person is having a bad day, but you also don't know if the person next to you is an undocumented student. And so why don't we all have the same just understanding and sympathy for each other that we have for other situations? Like, it's just as common to be undocumented as it is to be epileptic. I understand, like, I myself make sure that I understand how to help someone if they're having like some kind of crisis. You help your friend when they're freaking out, but like, you can help other people in your community who are a part of where you're from and where you live. And so like, if you have that privilege, like I have privilege, so I use mine in my way because that's what I can do.
Yeah, I think exactly what you said. Unfortunately, it's possible to go through both, secondary education, higher education, and be incredibly ignorant to the realities of this country and the world around us. And to be honest, I didn't even know what it meant to be undocumented until we had our partnership with Freedom University in 2015. So I managed to make it to my adult life without really knowing anything about that. And I think that's a shame, and we need to fight against that ignorance. Especially, everyone should receive that education, but we also are in an institution of higher learning that happens to be located in the Hudson Valley, where we have a huge immigrant population, a huge undocumented population, and so having just a basic awareness of that is incredibly important. And yeah, having an education like Bard's is such a privilege, and so I think not only making that actually accessible to people, but using that for the greater good and learning about these really important realities is critical.
So looking ahead to the future of OUSR, because Acacia, you are a senior and Olivia a junior, and so you're going to have members that are starting to graduate. So where do you see the future of OUSR going? Do you see it as more of a short-term project, kind of dealing with the issues at hand now, or more of a long-term project, kind of dealing with future issues ahead? And do you want to speak, Alicia, about the organizations that you are maybe involved in as well, the kind of the idea of short-term versus long-term projects?
So OUSR does both short-term and long-term. As for long-term, right now, like you said, Lila, we can't always guarantee, we don't know the shelf life of our organization with members graduating and leaders graduating. And we can't always predict how many people will be in our organization next year and the level of commitment. So our ultimate long-term goal would be to have an endowment scholarship based off of the Sanctuary Fund. And with the endowment scholarship, it would be a guarantee that every year a student or two would have the financial resources to come to Bard. Which is what the Sanctuary Fund is in place to do with additional resources. But without us here fundraising annually, there's no guarantee that that could happen. So the endowed scholarship is like the ultimate long-term goal, the most sustainable long-term goal. And short-term, we do things weekly, bi-weekly, from like phone banking to, the thing that I do the most is like fundraising for the Sanctuary Fund. We have a couple of different fundraising events at the bar in Tivoli. We try to like partner with the local community, especially in Tivoli. A lot of the local businesses in Tivoli are run by immigrants. So we try to partner with them, and we had a squash tournament for the Bard Sanctuary Fund. Earlier this year, we did a response to the DACA issue. We had a fundraising event at the bar for that, and we do phone banking, usually bi-weekly, for the DREAM Act, as well as anything else that comes up. So obviously, like, we would continue doing short-term things, but mainly, like, our long-term goal is to have an endowment scholarship for the Sanctuary Fund. And then also we want to do more outreaching with the communities. Acacia.
And yeah, just for anyone who doesn't know what an endowed scholarship is, basically if you're intending to create an endowed scholarship, you have to raise a certain amount of money, which is a lot of money, so we're sort of daunted by that fact. But once you raise that amount of money, it goes into an invested fund, and so as you use the money, it sort of replenishes itself. So that's our ultimate goal, because with the Sanctuary Fund, no matter how much money we raise, once it's been used for certain student scholarships, it's gone. Whereas with an endowed scholarship, we could potentially, have students have scholarships and the money would just replenish itself. So it would sustain itself beyond perhaps the existence of OUSR or any similar organization. But yeah, we definitely, like, the ultimate goal is that this organization will continue to exist. I'm sure, unfortunately, the need is going to be there for quite some time to come. And yeah, so as Olivia had started to mention, we want to do a lot of community outreach because we do have an undocumented population at BARD, but it's very small in comparison to the undocumented population that surrounds BARD. And so we want to make sure we have a greater connection to that community, because I think typically BARD students aren't very connected to surrounding communities in general, and that is definitely a problem and, has cultivated some animosity there. And so, we've thrown around big ideas in the past in terms of, like, meeting both the direct needs of people in the surrounding community, like a lot of undocumented people, they can't necessarily access a driver's license, and so driving anywhere is a huge risk, and they are risking everything by just driving to the grocery store or driving their child to school. And so especially after the election, when everyone was in a state of heightened fear, I think just doing those basic tasks was incredibly difficult. So we were interested in creating some sort of program where interested BARD students could offer rides to undocumented people who felt uncomfortable driving. And then just anything else we could do to really show that BARD students care about this issue and are standing in solidarity. So just monthly meetings with the surrounding community that would include both immigrants and non-immigrants. So those are a few ideas we've had. And then just in general, my goal is always to find a way to have a massive intervention into the consciousness of this campus. So anything that we can do to get this campus more energized is crucial.
Let's see, okay. I'm a sophomore, and I am going to be co-leading with Lexi and Wiley, our other two leaders. They're seniors, so starting around next semester, I'll probably be taking a lot more charge. But we do have other first years that are, like, really interested in, like, doing things like managing their own workshops, and I even have students who've, like, come up to me and told me that they're interested in, like, someday becoming, like, just having more leadership roles in Million Hoodies. And, we have the same goal. You can never really know how much commitment your members will have to your organization. Like, every semester that changes in the club. But, the idea is that the need will still be there, in the same sense that, like, we'll still need help and we'll still need to be organizing. And it's like, it's a long-term movement. It's not like, it's like being prepared for long-term everything, because nothing is going to happen immediately and change is not going to happen immediately, and it's just like sitting down and getting ready for the long run, and making sure that, like, we have set up our organization with a strong enough foundation for other students to come in and take charge. So, Million Hoodies has been working on Freedom Cities, which is, our thing of, like, it sort of is like sanctuary for all. So it's like working in local communities with, like, local legislation and local politicians to have, like, small legislation that will help, communities, undocumented communities, and working with things like the police to make sure that you feel safe walking on the street, and rethinking our idea of safety and how we can work with that among our community, because, we can define safety amongst ourselves and make each other feel safe. And so strengthening our community through Freedom Cities and things like just spreading information. So we have like political education workshops just to make sure that everyone is on the same level, because you enter these political conversations and sometimes it's like there's a lot of isms and like overall ideals that not everybody has the same educational background. Not everybody can and have like throw around these words that are not basic knowledge. And so I think just making sure that we work a lot on like informing our members and our community and working with other organizations on campus and other organizations in the community, because there is more than just us. We say we do a lot of community engagement, but do we actually? And do we do like, 1 week we have students go out and do tutoring, but like, is it long term? Are we having long term commitments with these communities? Because we leave in cycles of 4 years, but these communities are here to stay. And so we need to create organizations that are self-sustainable in ways that like, as more students come, we can continue to help.
Awesome. Yeah, unless there's any other final points that any of you want to make, that's all the questions I have on my end. So I think now would be a good time to turn to the audience if you have any questions yourselves. Does anybody have one to start? Yes. Could you restate the name of your group? Sure, that question was just restating the name of the organizations that you are a part of.
My name is Alicia Rodriguez, and I'm here to represent the Million Hoodies Movement for Justice.
I'm Acacia Handel, and I'm representing OUSR, Organizing for Undocumented Students' Rights.
I'm Olivia Terzian, and I'm also with Organizing for Undocumented Students' Rights.
Any other questions in the audience? Fred? Do you have one? Yes. Yeah. So just to reiterate that question, in a scenario, say if a police officer were to come to class today and possibly try to take out a student or try to remove them from class, what would happen?
I can't speak definitively on this. As far as I know, that's a fairly unlikely situation. Schools, along with churches and hospitals, are considered sensitive locations. So typically, ICE, immigration enforcement officials, will not just randomly come to campus and try to deport someone. The school does have measures in place to try to prevent that from happening. So it's unlikely that immigration officials would have any idea who on this campus was documented and who was not documented. That information is not accessible to them. And in all normal instances, the school has rules in place to ensure that its officials do not collaborate with immigration officials in terms of sharing that information. So that situation is pretty unlikely, as far as I know.
Bruce? So again, that question was how could colleges, higher education institutions keep certain information confidential used as a way to help also protect students.
Again, I'm going to just speak from my limited understanding, and if there's anyone in the audience who has a greater understanding, please raise your hand and jump in. I think that the most important step that the school can take and has taken as much as it can is just not storing that information, not storing any information so that if, they were subpoenaed or they were required legally for any reason to give information on students over to the federal government, they wouldn't have information on whether or not students were documented. So that is the easiest step the school can take so that it's not, so that it does legally comply with any requests, but at the same time protects the safety of its students. And then also the school does have legal rights under most circumstances to keep the information of its students confidential. So unless, there was an extraordinary incident, that was related to terrorism or any extraordinary circumstance, the school typically would not have to hand over any confidential information that it had stored.
I'm not sure. I feel like a big part of this conversation is there's so many hypothetical scenarios that we don't know, and there's so much of it that's unexplored because it's a conversation that just has been recently started to have here, for example. So we don't know what these circumstances are if we've never had to think about them. So I think just questions like this, as much as they do stump you, is really important because you're just wow, that's something that I should start to think about. So I think it's just something that we can work on.
Yeah, and so there were a lot of criticisms of the sanctuary campus movement, and one of them was that some immigration advocates felt like the sanctuary campus movement was overblowing the potential ramifications that the election would have for undocumented students on college campuses. And so a lot of them talked about there actually typically are very minimal risks to undocumented students when they're on a college campus. So I think that's something that's important to understand. I'm sorry, I'm so tired. I keep forgetting what I'm going to say, and there was an important point there. I'll let you know if it comes back.
Any more questions? Oh,
I just remembered. Okay, here we go. So yeah, but I think that a big concern that the sanctuary campus movement was reflecting was that, a lot of college-age students who are undocumented have DACA, and so with DACA, there's a federal database that has stored the personal information of students with DACA. And so I think that, there obviously are some concerns about whatever information the college itself is storing, but there's, to me and my understanding, there are larger concerns in terms of what information the federal government already has. So I think that's a sort of more important concern to focus on.
Any other questions from the audience? Bonnie? So that question was, what can BARD as a school and institution campus be doing to continue to address these concerns of immigration and students' rights and all the various things that we've discussed today?
I think continuing to allow us, students and organizations into the conversation, forming groups with staff and students and faculty and students, and just having this conversation with us, and just allowing the perspectives that are needed into the conversations, passing the phrase of ally to the truest word of being an ally, and just being open to it, and being open to maybe needing change. And I think we have good first steps, having conversations like this and having panels like this and including things like this in the curriculums, just as a good first step.
Yeah, I think as the school already knows and is reflected by the Sanctuary Fund, one of the biggest issues is access. And so I think the school has been fairly great about, stating its support for these vulnerable communities, but, we always say, put your money where your mouth is. I think especially, BARD has limited financial resources, so the school is always concerned when new fundraising efforts are taking place. So I would love to see more members of the administration invested in the Sanctuary Fund, and not necessarily seeing it as competition to other fundraising efforts. Something that we've talked about a lot in OUSR is we've been doing Bernie-style fundraising. And so we've raised thousands of dollars through small donations, and that's worked well to be able to, create like one scholarship and provide translated documents to help students get into the BSECs and things like that. But we have nowhere near the amount of money we would need for an endowed scholarship. So I think for the larger goals that we have in mind, we really need big-time donors. And BARD is very protective of its big-time donors. So we really would need the support of the administration in working with those donors to see if any of them would be interested in financing the endowed scholarship. And that, to me, would be one of the biggest things the school could do to show that, the Sanctuary Fund wasn't just a name that would give it the recognition of being a progressive institution, but it actually is willing to make sacrifices to support undocumented students. And then I think something I've noticed about BARD is that at this institution, there's sort of a culture of there's help if you need it, but you have to seek it out yourself. And I think that has a lot of ramifications. I was just talking to someone about it in terms of, people who are addicted to drugs and whatever, and there's just not a lot of like comprehensive support systems that are proactive in meeting with students who are at risk for various things. And so that's a little bit of a tangent, but I know from speaking with undocumented students at BARD that there's just not a very strong support network. And so I think really creating that network and having more services that were tailored to meet the unique needs of undocumented students, and actually like reaching out to those students instead of waiting until they were really struggling and had to seek out help on their own. So I think, more comprehensive, proactive support for students with all sorts of issues and identities, but specifically undocumented and refugee students. The consortium is doing a great job, but greater education and awareness. I think a lot of BARD students, as I mentioned previously, have no understanding of the unique struggles of their undocumented peers. So I think, even including like in L&T, just like basic political education would be amazing, and I think would really revolutionize the BARD education. So that's something that I would advocate for. And lastly, community engagement, really ensuring maybe even that BARD students are required to go out into the community and support the people living in our midst who, as Alicia said, we're here for 4 years. They're here, for as long as they live here, which is much longer than 4 years. So yeah.
I'm spot on. Spot on, Alicia, yeah.
I think one more thing on the same line of education, like just making sure everybody understands, not even just like specifically immigrant student struggles, but just immigrant struggles in general, because then we would begin to understand our entire community and our entire society more. Just like how we talk a lot about money because a lot of it is about money. A lot of people stay undocumented for many years just because of lack of money. A lot of people don't even know how much money it costs to get your permanent residency. Like the easy part is getting citizenship. That's the easy part because you already did the hard part. The hard part is all of the tests. Like we had to find an affidavit. I think that's how you say that in English. And like finding someone who can sign on to, like, if needed, be financial support for your whole entire family. And sometimes that means for like 8 people. Not a lot of people are willing to sign a legal paper saying like, if these people are broke, I'm gonna support them. But like people don't know that we need things like that. We looked for an affidavit for like years, and like you have to pay, like you don't even know, but you have to pay your affidavit too, because like it's not a favor, it's like a job. And other than that, like you have to get a lot of like tests, like medical tests that you can only get at certain government approved clinics that are actually like worse than regular clinics. I went to a clinic to get like, I don't remember what kind of blood test, and they took my blood out wrong, and I like almost passed out, and then like threw out the tubes, and they were like, we're gonna do it again, and like I had a large bruise on my arm for like 2 weeks. And so we're just thinking about the system in which we already make this so much harder for these people. We want them to be a part of our system, but we make it almost impossible because it costs hundreds and thousands of dollars for lawyers and fees and all these things. So I just think that like basic information of like what it takes, and don't ever let somebody catch you saying just become a citizen, because it's never that easy. And I think just becoming a lot more sympathetic. And this campus in general is really apathetic. Like, yeah, we understand bad things are happening, but like why is it important to me? And I think and it's hard to make people care, but trying to find a way.
Any more questions from the audience? Nope. Okay, I think that about wraps everything up. Thank you guys again so much for all the lovely things you said. And thank you for coming.